wrapping up here our equipment that has to do with powder and powder measuring. I have a few powder funnels here and a powder trickler. And basically these are just some additional pieces that you will want if you are going to be manually measuring out your powder. The funnels are just what you would expect. Basically, once you've measured out your powder into a pan or something, you will pour it through the funnel, and there's a tapered cone on the bottom here which will fit to most cases to dispense that properly. The second type I have here is actually a combination powder funnel and weighing boat. So basically you put this on your scale, measure out the powder into it, and then tip it right into your case. So those work really well. The one over here, this is a Lyman that runs about $5, and this is an RCBS, which I think costs about $7. In the back here we have a powder trickler. And what this does is you pour powder into the top here, and then this rod has a screw in it, and there's an opening inside here. So as you turn this handle, small amounts of powder will start coming out the end. And that's really helpful when you're trying to weigh out very small amounts of powder. Say you want to weigh out 41 grains of powder. You set your powder measure to around 40.5 grains. Since it's not exact, it'll get you close. Then you weigh it out, and then you will trickle the powder up to the desired weight. Oh, and the powder trickler is going to cost you about $10 to $15. Another really handy piece of equipment for reloading is going to be a loading block. And I have two examples here in front of you. And basically what these are is just a place to store your cases upright, to keep them from tipping over, keep them organized while you're loading them. The one on the left here is one I just made out of a block of wood and a Forstner bit with a drill press. That works really well, but the downside to it is that you can only make these holes one diameter, and also if when we're talking about lubrication later on, a lot of times you're going to lubricate the brass while it's in the loading block, and the wood absorbs the lubrication. Still works well, but the plastic ones you can pick up for maybe $5 or $6, and just about any company makes those. RCBS, Hornaday, MTM, all make loading blocks. In addition to being plastic, which is nice, they also have, I don't know if you can see that in there or not, but there's basically two different diameters in there. And so a 308 case, for example, will sit higher up, but a smaller case like a 223 will sit deeper in there. So they're multi-purpose as far as the diameter of cases that they'll fit. Next we're going to move on to equipment pertaining to case cleaning and preparation. The first thing that you're going to need is a way to clean your brass. And basically that's going to boil down to two choices. Either a vibratory tumbler, like the one that you see in front of you, or an ultrasonic cleaner. And I've used both fairly extensively. I owned an ultrasonic cleaner for about a year. I picked one up from Harbor Freight. It was the larger of the two versions that they had there. And if you do decide to go with an ultrasonic cleaner, I would recommend that one. It is actually the exact same machine as is sold under Lyman's brand for about $110. It's at Harbor Freight. They sell the exact machine just with different branding on it for about half the price. But there was two things that I did not like about the ultrasonic cleaner. The first was case volume. I was only able to clean about half the amount of cases in the ultrasonic cleaner that I was able to clean in the vibratory tumbler. In addition to that, and to me the larger of the two problems, was that the cases come out wet. And you have to dry them before you can load them. Obviously you can't have your powder be wet. So you either had to let the cases air dry overnight, or you had to put them on a cookie sheet or something and put them in the oven between 170 and 200 degrees to dry them out, which still took a while, and it was just a large extra step that I found time consuming. That led me back to the vibratory tumbler. Now, they are not without their faults as well. And the two main problems with the vibratory tumbler are that they can be loud and they can also be dusty. And so you're going to want to use a vibratory tumbler either in a basement or a garage or someplace where noise and dust isn't going to be an issue. With a vibratory tumbler, you have different types of media that you're going to use to clean the brass, and the two most common are corn cob and crushed walnut. Of those two, I would recommend avoiding the corn cob. It is the far dustier of the two. It doesn't last as long, and the biggest problem with it that I found was that I would get pieces of corn cob stuck in the flash holes of my brass. So I'd have to visually inspect every flash hole and clean them out. It was just a very large pain. With the crushed walnut, I don't have any of those issues, and it's much less dusty. On top of that, I was actually able to find crushed walnut being sold at pet stores as snake bedding, and it's the exact same stuff, crushed walnut, that is marketed for reloaders at about a quarter of the cost. So that's one tip for you, is to pick up your crushed walnut for your vibratory tumbler from a pet store, and it's sold as snake bedding. But anyway, the vibratory tumblers they vary in price. The particular one I have here is one that I've used for several years. It's made by Frankfurt Arsenal, and I have had extremely good luck with it. It works really well, and I think I only paid about $40 for it. The other manufacturers that make vibratory tumblers generally charge $60, $70, $80 for them. I have never used a different one, but I'm sure they all work equally well. You know, the Frankfurt Arsenal at $40 has worked well for me, and I would assume it would work well for you. After you have tumbled your brass in the vibratory tumbler, you're going to need a way to separate that brass from the tumbling media. And you can do that just really about any way you please. For the first couple years I reloaded, all I did was I had drilled a whole bunch of holes in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket. And I would dump the brass in there and kind of shake it around for a while and try to get most of it out. And then I would take each brass and physically, you know, tap it and try to get all the media out. It works, but it's time consuming, and there is a much better alternative, which is to use a media separator. I have the RCBS version, which I am reasonably happy with. I'll point out a flaw in it here in just a minute, but basically it's an enclosed capsule, if you will, that opens up. And there is another basket in here with holes in it. And this opens up. You put your brass in here, close it back up, and then spin this, and all the media comes flying out of there. It works really well at separating media. There's really no media left in the brass after you do this for just, about 30 seconds. Much quicker than my old bucket version. So I would recommend a media separator. I think I paid about $35 or $40 for this one. And if I was to buy one again, I might not buy this one. What I don't like about it is these plastic hinges. And I've noticed with use, these are just like those hinges where it can pop off. And I've noticed that sometimes these kind of get stuck in a weird position and kind of tweak the plastic a little bit. So I don't know that I would recommend this particular one, but I would recommend some type of media separator. Moving on, talking about case preparation equipment, we're going to look at case trimmers. And what a case trimmer does is pretty much what it sounds like, which is to trim a case to length. And this is going to be important for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is that a case needs to be within a certain length range to be able to chamber properly. If the case is too long, it's not going to chamber properly. And the cases do expand, as I was talking about during the sizing dies, but they also lengthen. As every time you shoot them, they lengthen slightly. And so over the course of time, they will lengthen enough that if you don't trim them, they're not going to chamber properly. So generally speaking, you're going to have to trim to length even with just high volume rifle cases. Generally handgun is not too much of an issue, but even if you're shooting volume rifle ammunition where you're not too concerned about accuracy, you're still going to have to trim the cases maybe every 5 to 10 reloads depending on which caliber it is. Some will expand more than others. In addition to that, you also will want to trim your cases to length for match rounds. The main thing when you're trying to load rounds for accuracy is that you want consistency. And one of the ways you can get consistency is by trimming all of the cases to the exact same length. So, the one that you see before you is made by L.E. Wilson. It is a very good little case trimmer. This is the one I bought right when I first started reloading, and I have never upgraded it, although I might at some point in the near future. But this is a manual case trimmer, and it's about as manual as they get. It has a hand crank here, and most case trimmers are going to have some type of collet or caliber specific way of holding the brass. This particular one uses these little, it's kind of a sleeve, and what happens is, got my 308 case here again, you take the case already sized and you insert it, and it sticks out on both ends. And then, actually I have this set up for 223 right now, but this sets in here, and then depending on where this screw is adjusted, you turn this crank and it will trim the brass until it reaches the stop. And so it is, going to trim them to exactly the same length every time. I really like the L.E. Wilson. It does get a bit fatiguing because you have to hold this by hand in this groove here, and after you go through 40 or 50 cases while also turning this crank by hand, it does get a bit fatiguing, but it is extremely precise. There are other options out there made by just about every reloading company. Some of them can be hooked up to cordless drills, and other ones are electric, where you don't turn it by hand crank. They have a little motor with them. Most of the ones that I've seen the reviews anyway are somewhat varied as far as how good the results are. And so that's why I have not upgraded mine yet. This thing it doesn't get any more precise than this, but it is fatiguing. The Ellie Wilson runs about $35 if I remember, and the other ones are going to run you between $70 all the way up to $150. As part of the process of trimming your cases to length, you're going to need some way to measure the case length. And a calipers comes in very handy for that measurement. In addition to case length, you'll also want to be measuring the overall length of the cartridge, and a calipers works really well for that as well. Really, just about any calipers like this will work. The specifications we're talking about here, 1/1000th of an inch is fine. You don't need to buy some crazy machinist's calipers that are, starrettes or something where they're really expensive. These were, I think, $15 either from Harbor Freight or online somewhere, and they work just fine for this. Wrapping up the case preparation equipment, we have a few items here. The first is a primer pocket cleaning tool. And there are several versions of these made by just about every reloading company manufacturer. But the idea is that you have some sort of scraper or brush that reaches inside the primer pocket to clean that out. These are going to run you somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $6. They're fairly inexpensive. Over the years, I've gotten a little bit lax with my primer pocket cleaning. I haven't really noticed that it makes much of a difference so long as they're reasonably clean. You don't want there to be any buildup or anything in there, but there's always going to be a slight darkening in the primer pocket, and I, over time, have kind of realized that it doesn't really pay to put the effort into cleaning that out. The second piece of equipment here is the flash hole deburring tool. And if you'll recall from the introduction video, I mentioned that as one of the steps during reloading. This is one of those steps that isn't entirely necessary ever, I don't believe. The only time you would ever even consider using that tool is if you're loading match ammunition. And what that's going to do is uniform the flash hole. It's going to remove any burrs on that, open it up if it's slightly odd shaped or has a little bit excess material there. But it is not a necessary tool. It's debatable whether it does anything, even in match ammunition. But at about $10, it might be something that you might want to consider. The last tool here is something that you will need after you have trimmed your cases to length. And this is a chamfering and deburring tool. And basically what this does, let me grab my case here, is after you have trimmed this case to length, it's going to have some sharp edges on it. And this tool is going to reach inside and remove the burr from the inside, and then you flip it around and it removes any burr from the outside. These are going to run you about $6 or $7, and that is a tool definitely worth having. The last thing I want to talk about here with case preparation is preparing the primer pockets of military brass. When you have military brass, there is a crimp that is applied to keep the primer in place. And you can pop out an old primer relatively easily, but seating the new primer is either impossible or very difficult. And if you try to force it in there, you'll get a lot of crushed primers, and it's just not going to work very well for you at all. So to prepare the primer pocket of military brass, you're going to need one of two tools, either a swager or a reamer. And I'm going to outline the differences between the two of them here. A reamer is basically a small cutter that will actually insert into the primer pocket and remove a small amount of brass, which is going to be the portion of the brass that has the crimp. So you're actually cutting away a little bit of the primer pocket. This isn't necessarily a problem, but there is the possibility of removing too much brass. Also, the reamer is not quite as good at uniforming the primer pockets as the alternative, which is swaging the primer pocket. And what a swager is a tool that basically rolls the crimp over. You're not removing any brass. It just pretty much does what I was saying. It just takes that crimp and kind of presses it back and smooths it out. What I have in front of you here is the Dillon Super Swager. And if you're going to go with a swaging tool, this is the only one I would recommend. There are other ones made out there that go into your reloading press that will swage the primer pocket, but there's a lot of issues with the versions that go in your press. The Super Swager, on the other hand, is a fantastic tool. You can swage these primer pockets incredibly quickly, much faster than you can ream them, and the results are better. The downside is that this thing costs $100. The reamers, on the other hand, you can pick up for, $20 to $25 or possibly even less. So if you have military brass, you need one or the other. If you can afford the Dillon Super Swager, go for it. Otherwise, if not, the reamers will get the job done. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about case lubrication. Unless you have pistol cartridges with carbide dyes, as I discussed earlier, you are going to need to lubricate your cases before you attempt to size them. If you try to size your brass without using any lubrication, your case will get stuck in there and you will not be able to get it back out. So you do need to lubricate in some way. The way that I first learned to do this was with a case lube pad. And basically what this is just you open it up, it's just a foam pad that you rub lubrication over, and then you take 10 cases and you roll them across this pad, which puts lubrication on the outside. Then you have to go back with a brush and brush inside to lubricate the inside of the case mouth. It's extremely messy. It's very time consuming. I hated it. I still hate it. I wouldn't recommend it. The far superior version, and I think you actually get better results too, is to use a lubrication spray. And these last a very long time. I've been using the same bottle for quite a while. It doesn't take much. Basically what you do is you take your loading block filled with your clean brass and you just give it a few spritzes from each side until there's just a really light coating on there, and the spray works really well. Now I'm going to discuss equipment used to prime your brass. And when it comes to priming brass, you basically have two options. You can either use your reloading press, and most presses do have the capability to prime brass, or you can use a hand priming tool such as the two that I have here in front of you. I generally prefer using the hand priming tool over your press if you're using a single stage or a turret press. Now if you have a quality progressive press like the Dillon, those actually work incredibly well for priming. But as far as the single stage and turret presses go, I recommend the hand priming options. And the reasons for that are twofold. The first reason is, actually somewhat of a comfort or leisure type thing. You can use the hand priming tool anywhere, and there's really not a whole lot that you have to pay attention to when you're priming. And I hesitate to say that somewhat because, you do have to pay attention, but it is one of these somewhat mindless tasks. And so with the hand priming tool, you can sit in your living room and be watching TV or a movie or something and just, priming away with your brass. Whereas if you're doing it on your press, you have to sit in your basement or garage or wherever you're at and do that there. The other reason is, the much more important of the two, which is that when you're using the press to prime, the press has too much leverage. The lever on it is too long, you get too much leverage, and you lose a lot of your tactile sensation while priming the brass. The problem with that is that sometimes the primer enters the primer pocket at a slight angle. And if you're using the press, you tend to just ram it in without noticing, and it goes in at an angle and kind of gets crushed in there. But if you're using the hand priming tool, it's immediately obvious that something isn't right, and you can check it and fix it and make sure that it's entering properly. So of the two, I recommend the hand priming tools. There's two of them here in front of you. The one on the left here is the Lee Auto Prime, and the one on the right is the RCBS hand priming tool. Throughout the course of this video here, I've been recommending a lot of Lee tools, but this is not one of those times. This Lee hand priming device is quite frankly terrible. The handle on it is very thin, and I've seen these break before. In addition to that, it's kind of sharp, and it becomes painful pretty quickly while you're using this. You do have to use a reasonable amount of force when you're just squeezing by hand to prime brass. So I do not recommend the Lee one. It also requires a special shell holder for your caliber to hold the brass while you do it. The RCBS version, on the other hand, is much better made. It's much smoother, it's much beefier, it works extremely well. You do still get some fatigue just because of the what you're doing. It is still requiring a reasonable amount of effort, but much more comfortable. And also, this one is universal, so any size brass just snaps into these two jaws that they have over here. That was a 308, grab a 223, and anything is going to just snap right in there. So there's no changing out shell holders or anything. The only thing you ever have to change out on this particular tool is the priming rod. You will have to switch it, but if you're using a large primer versus a small primer. But other than that, there's really not a lot you have to do with it. The RCBS is kind of expensive. It runs about $50 to $55, whereas the Lee is somewhere around $15. So if you can't afford the RCBS, the Lee is an alternative. However, honestly, if it was me, if I couldn't afford the RCBS, I would just do it with the press because the Lee is that terrible. The last thing I want to talk about as far as equipment is a bullet puller. And basically, the bullet puller, again, these names are not ambiguous. It does exactly what it sounds like it does. It pulls bullets. And the reason why you might want to do that is if you made a mistake when you were loading a round. So, for example, here's a loaded round of ammunition, and on this particular one, it was one that I was adjusting my dies, and my brass got slightly bent here when I was seating my bullet. Now, that leaves me with a problem, because First of all, I have no good way of disposing of that, and in addition to that, I'm wasting a perfectly good bullet and some perfectly good powder. So what this bullet puller allows me to do is it has a collet in it, and this goes into your press, and by a cam action allows you to pull that bullet out. And that not only allows you to reuse your materials, but it also prevents you from figuring out what in the world you would otherwise do with that. This particular one is made by Hornaday, and it works really well. I think it costs about $30, and then you do have to buy caliber specific collets for it. Not caliber as in, you know, like 308 versus some other 30 caliber round, but it does have to be bullet diameter specific. So, you know, if you had a 30-06 and a 308, both of these would work with the same collet. They do make another type of bullet puller that's it looks like a hammer, and basically it's an inertia system where it will pull the bullet out based on inertia. You kind of swing it like a hammer. I've never actually used one of those, so I can't make any recommendations on them. They're cheaper. I think they run between $5 and $10, so that is one alternative that you could try. Well, I hope you learned a little bit about reloading equipment and approximately how much it's going to cost you to get started. While this video was fairly comprehensive as far as the equipment needed for reloading, there are some other pieces of equipment that are needed for some more advanced techniques, which I'll be covering in later videos. If you have any questions about reloading or reloading equipment, please post them on my YouTube page.